Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 10 May 2018 Ask Tom session. The focus of today's session is going to be GDPR. Just a quick reminder, we are recording today's session, so if you have questions that you want to ask in this public forum, please make sure you don't reveal anything that your company would not like to have be public knowledge. So again, the recording has already started. Okay. Because we're going to be talking about GDPR, it's important that you understand that I am not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV, and that nothing that I say during the course of today's session should be considered to be legal advice. GDPR is an extremely important business issue, and the ramifications for not meeting GDPR can be pretty serious. So if you have a question about what your responsibilities are or whether what you're doing is adequate, feel free to ask in here, but anything I tell you is just informational. You should always double check that with your legal team. GDPR becomes live in just 14 days. It's been a 2-year journey since GDPR was approved. It's amazing to think we're down to just 2 weeks really before this thing is live. I will be doing a webinar for SC Magazine on the 24th, the day before it goes live. So that should be a really interesting one. Thought we'd just do a real quick review on GDPR. I'm not going to run you through one of those exhaustive, 39 articles this and 99 recitals that. Point-by-point analysis. If you're interested in GDPR, you've probably been through all that stuff already, but we will just cover it in brief. We'll talk a little bit about database security in GDPR, and then as always, and this is the main point of Ask Tom, this turns into an open forum for Q&A on GDPR or anything having to do with Oracle database security. GDPR is arguably the most important IT issue of the year. In my job at Oracle, I do travel around the world. I meet with a lot of different people, and almost everywhere I go globally, both Europe and outside of Europe, GDPR is one of the top business conversations that I'm likely to have. And this is from up at the C-suite level, CIO, CISO, in one case even a CEO, down to IT managers and DBAs asking, how do I get from where I currently am to a point where I am comfortable with GDPR. So if you go to oracle.com, you'll see GDPR right on the very front page. And that's true for almost any of the global companies right now. It is a regulation that's been around for a while. It was first published a little over 2 years ago, and it does become effective after a 2-year period in which everyone was supposed to be getting ready for it later this month. The big things about GDPR are the scope of it. It's probably the most sweeping privacy regulation in the world, and also the fines for non-compliance. The maximum fine under GDPR is 4% of a company's gross global revenue, and that's, any company that gets hit with a 4% fine has lost a serious amount of money. Okay. When you look at GDPR, there is a lot there. There are 39 different articles. There are over 90, I believe 99 different recitals that go with this. And each one of those is telling you to do something or not to do something. At the heart of GDPR, though, is a shift in data ownership. And for those who are outside of the European Union, this is probably one of the hardest things to wrap your head around. Before GDPR, data really belonged to the people who collected the data, and we had a responsibility to the business to take care of that data. Under GDPR, data belongs to the people that it describes, the data subjects, and we are the custodians of that data, and we have a responsibility to the owners of that data, the data subjects, to take care of that data and to use it in a manner that the data subject agrees with. Everything else in GDPR follows from that one critical shift in ownership. We are now holding somebody else's property, their data, and as a custodian of their data, we have a responsibility to the people who we're holding data for. There are a lot of things that go into that responsibility. You have a responsibility to protect the data. You have a responsibility to use the data in a manner that the owner agrees with, and you have to obtain their consent in a clear, easy to understand fashion. You are not able to give that data to somebody else that is not going to protect it properly or that is not agreed to by the owner of the data. If the owner asks you to remove their data, then in most cases, you have a responsibility to do that removal, to erase the data. Not always. Sometimes the law requires you to keep the data for a while, but the data belongs to the person it describes. If they ask you to remove it, your default should be yes, unless there's a reason why you have to say no. So all of this stuff goes into the General Data Privacy Protection Regulation, GDPR. GDPR is something that impacts almost every company that operates outside of its own borders. So if you're a global company, if you're in the tourism business, if you're in the financial services business, if you're a manufacturer and you sell globally, GDPR is likely to apply to you. It covers all residents of a European member state, regardless of their citizenship. So for example, if I am a Canadian, all right, if I'm a Canadian company and I am servicing or I am sending workers over to France, so these are Canadian citizens that I send over to France, but they're going to be working for my company from France. Those Canadian citizens, while they are resident in France, are covered by GDPR. Conversely, if I am a German expatriate, my citizenship is German, but I happen to be living in Australia, then while I am in Australia, I am not covered by GDPR, and my business dealings with companies in Australia don't normally fall under GDPR. I want to take you back to that first thing. I'm not a lawyer, so everybody's business model is a little different. There's lots of variations there, but in general, GDPR covers residents of a member state, regardless of their citizenship. Okay? Now, it applies to anybody who markets goods or services within the EU. So if I'm explicitly selling to the European Union, then I have a requirement to follow GDPR. And selling in the European Union, we're still waiting for the first court case on this, but most people consider it to mean I have a web presence in the European Union, especially if I've translated it into EU-type languages. If I am doing print advertising or social media campaigns that are targeted at the EU, if there's anything that can be looked at and said you're trying to target or make money off the European Union, then you have this duty to take care of the data that you get on European Union residents. So GDPR is a whole lot more than a technology issue. And it's because I work for Oracle, usually when I'm called in to talk to somebody, I'm talking about the technology behind, if I'm making air quotes here, solving GDPR. But technology doesn't solve GDPR. Technology supports a solution for GDPR, but you're almost always going to have process changes. You're going to have changes in how you relate to your customers, probably how you relate to your employees. It's not something that you buy a product and install the product and voila, you're GDPR compliant. GDPR is almost always going to require some application changes. It'll probably require changes at the infrastructure level, may require changes to your database, but there's a lot of things that are going to go into GDPR compliance. You're going to do those GDPR things mostly, in part because it's the right thing to do, but also in part because the fear of getting fined if you don't do them is high. Now, there's a lot of different articles in GDPR. One of them, Article 83, specifically is fines. And you'll want to take a look at some of the things that are used to judge. Is this a 4% fine, a 2% fine, or are we just going after a couple $100 million? Because there's different levels of fines that the European Union can levy on you. And a lot of it is going to depend on how your company has been behaving in the lead up to the infringement. Have you been negligent in how you're handling data? Have you not been taking GDPR seriously? Then your fines may be a little bit higher. Have you been diligently trying to comply? You've got a track record of implementing good controls. Anyone who looks at your website can see that you are obtaining consent and doing your best to enforce it, and it was just an accidental slip. Then your fine might be a little bit lower. So there's things that are going to impact what that judgment is going to be. But at the board level, the risk that they're looking at is that 4% of global revenue. And for that reason, if GDPR applies to your company, there's a good chance you have a program in place to deal with it. Now, where should you start? If you haven't already started, you're probably not going to finish in 14 days because there's a lot that needs to be done. But for your Oracle databases, there's some easy things you can do. One thing that you should do is download the Database Security Assessment tool and do an assessment of your data, of your database. There is a concept within GDPR called the Privacy Impact Assessment. Any system that stores personal data should have a Privacy Impact Assessment done on it. If you take a look at the two modules in DBSAT, the Sensitive Data Discovery module and the Configuration and Risk Scoring module, those two modules get you a long way towards your Privacy Impact Assessment. If your database isn't already encrypted, you might want to take a look at encrypting it. If you aren't already watching what people do inside your database with auditing, you should probably enable audit and just a default unified audit policies will get you a long way. If you have copies of production data in non-production environments, then you're either going to want to secure them the same way you secure production, or better yet, consider ways to remove sensitive data from those non-production environments, mask them or something similar. Okay. Now, to help you on this journey, there is a lot of resources available for you. If you just search Oracle and GDPR, you'll get probably 20 or 30 things that come from Oracle. I've highlighted 3 of them here. There is a white paper called Accelerate Your Response to the EU GDPR using the Oracle Database Security. This white paper gives you a step-by-step, all those different articles and the places where the database security pieces play in them. There is a similar white paper for the Oracle applications. If you're using one of the Oracle applications, you probably should read that white paper as well. And there is an overall GDPR security page that covers security at a broader level, not just database, but infrastructure, the identity management, kind of the bigger Oracle story around GDPR. So do take a look at these if it applies to you. If you haven't already downloaded the Securing Oracle Database, a Technical Primer, we do have a chapter on EU GDPR and database security in there. It's an excellent chapter. The guy who wrote it is really passionate about GDPR, and he's speaking to you now. It's not maybe my best work, but it certainly isn't my worst work. Please read it. And of course, Database Security Assessment Tool. If you were on last month's Ask Tom, we do have GDPR findings that we'll print out from the Database Security Assessment Tool. Okay. So as part of Ask Tom, there is a mechanism to ask questions on the website. We don't get a whole lot of these, but I did get one this month. It was a question about using the Oracle 12c database, and the person said we have a requirement that we should encrypt our data at rest. I don't see the person who asked it on the web conference. I did email the person because they chose to give their email address, and that person hasn't responded yet. But of course, anytime you're talking encryption of data at rest within Oracle, the answer is usually either DPMS crypto, which is a way for you to write your own encryption routines in your application, or transparent data encryption, either at the column or table space level. Okay. And that is it for the prepared session today. What I'm hoping you've taken away from this is, GDPR just around the corner. If it applies to you, there's a good chance you're well along on your mitigation of it. If not, there's a lot of things you can do at the database level to help with those efforts, and some of the resources to look for.
On the Audit Vault, it currently does not pull back the policies in 12. Is that expected to come out soon?
It pulls back standard audit policies, but not unified audit policies. And we won't have that fixed until 13. Bundle Patch 8, by the way, is due out in about 2 weeks for Audit Vault and Database Firewall. And Bundle Patch 8 is going to have a new set of reports for GDPR. Hang on a second here. Let me find my cheat sheet on what all's in Bundle Patch 8. Oops, wrong one. There it is. Okay, so Bundle Patch 8 is due out very shortly. It has GDPR reports in there. We've also modified it to support UEFI boot. I don't know if you've tried installing Audit Vault and Database Firewall on very new hardware that no longer has legacy BIOS boot. It wouldn't install before. This new release does support it, and from an Oracle standpoint, there's one server that we produce, the X7-2, that no longer ships with BIOS, so UEFI is a requirement. We've added support, as you can see, for JRE9, and we've also restored support for Windows Service. We're supporting collecting data from the Autonomous Data Warehouse Cloud Service and also from the latest version of MySQL. And we've got a new Audit Vault agent setting that allows you to use a NAT IP address for the AV server. And again, that's here in just a couple of weeks that we'll expect to see that. Reminds me, last month we talked about DBSat. Also, later this month, we're releasing version 2.02 of it. This is a minor update. The big things are we've added in support for connections to the database server over a TLS channel, TCPS if your listener set up that way. We already had support for native network encryption, but we have some customers that like TLS instead of native, so we've added support for them. Also for Exadata Express and Autonomous Data Warehouse, and with the Autonomous Transaction Processing Cloud Service, which is coming up this summer, we have already begun the process of certifying with that, and we expect to have that out within days or weeks of the release. We did have one bug that had been reported in 2.01. That was with handling large number of records in a table as we're doing sensitive data discovery. So if you had more than 2 million records, we had an inability to scan that. We have fixed that buffer overflow issue, and we now can handle over 2 million records in a single table. For GDPR, there have not yet been any legal challenges because it is not yet effective. But my understanding of the fine structure for GDPR is that it doesn't come after individuals, it comes after the company. So, Patrick, if you did something under GDPR that caused an infringement of a data subject's rights or a breach, then it is unlikely that you would personally be charged. Your company might take issue with you, but the data protection authorities probably would not come after you trying to get $4 billion or something like that. Now, do you need to worry about GDPR? I would say yes, you do. As DBAs, we're the custodians of the database. We're usually not the data owners. But often the true data owners, which are usually the application owners, don't understand their responsibilities. So if I had an application owner who was asking me to clone production back to non-production, and I wasn't comfortable with that security, I would probably raise the visibility of that within my organization, bring it up, through my manager up to an appropriate level to ensure that the company wasn't being put at risk. I don't think anybody would have something to say to you negatively if you're trying, not going to the newspaper or something like that, but if you're just within the company raising the question, hey, does this put us at risk? And, depending on how you're, how they have, I'm going to use your quotes, taken care of security issues, there's a good chance they are putting it at risk. Again, Patrick says maybe one can see from GDPR is that individuals are out of scope can be charged. It's unlikely that an individual would be charged. Again, not a lawyer, take that with a grain of salt, but GDPR is targeted at companies, companies who are controlling data for a subject. Your company, if you did something that was egregiously bad, could decide to take legal action against you if you were negligent. That might be in your terms of employment. But it's unlikely that the data protection authorities would come after you as a person. Because, unless you're really wealthy, by the time they finished taking you to court, your lawyers, you paid off the lawyers, you wouldn't have any money to go after anyway, realistically. And Patrick says, what if a company is a customer service provider for databases for other companies? So that would make sense. Would the service provider be charged or the company that uses the DB service provider? That is a really interesting question, Patrick, and it gets into something that I wasn't going to cover because I didn't want to turn this into a long, explanation of GDPR, but let me just get up a slide real quick here. I think this is the deck I need. Yeah, here we go. So under GDPR, there are a couple of different roles. One of those is the data subject. That's the person who owns the data. And the data subject gives their consent to a data controller. So in your example, that would be the company that's using the database service provider. The database service provider, the data controller, the one who is responsible for the processing activity, then in turn will have third parties working with them. That might be a hosting company. They would have data processors working with them. That would be someone who actively does something with the data the controller has collected. And the processor is responsible both to the controller and directly to the data subjects for any infringements of rights. So as a controller, it's your responsibility to make sure that your processors are doing the right thing, but the processors also have a legal duty to take care of data subjects' data. So it does not depend necessarily on the contract between the company and the service provider. The data processor is explicitly called out. Now, third parties, their responsibility is to the controller. So if they're not actively processing the data, then their responsibility is to the controller, and the controller would retain liability. Yeah, so the controller could be completely outside of the EU, like Facebook, for example, would be a data controller. And, one of those companies that does surveys on Facebook but has permission to pull data, they would be a data processor because they're getting data through the Facebook channel. But they would both be responsible to the data subjects. Patrick asks, a database service provider that is hosting, operating the databases, is that a third party or a processor? It depends on which one of those it is, Patrick. If they're hosting the databases, which means they're just providing infrastructure as a service, then realistically they become a third party rather than a processor. But if they are actually operating the databases, they have a hand in the day-to-day operations, they would almost certainly be considered a processor, at which point they adopt the regulation for data subjects. There's I don't have an example of it, but if any of you are Oracle Cloud customers, you've probably seen new languages from us recently around GDPR and how we're handling our responsibility both to you as our data controllers and to the data subjects under GDPR. Because as database as a service people, we believe that we're acting as a data processor. Doesn't really get the difference between hosting a database and operating a database. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're not using the Oracle Cloud. Suppose you are using Amazon's cloud. And when you go into Amazon's cloud, you spin up an EC2 instance. And the only thing Amazon is doing for you is hosting your instance. You're responsible for the database that's on that instance. You are the database administrator. Everything that happens to that database, that's you. In this case, Amazon is a third party providing a service to you as the data controller. They're not actively processing anything. Now, instead of using EC2, suppose you use RDS. Well, what you're getting is database as a service, and Amazon is managing that database for you. You as the data controller do not have the ability to manage that database. It's being done by Amazon. In this case, Amazon becomes a data processor because they are actively involved with the management of the data. If we take that same example and put it under Oracle, suppose you stand up an OCI instance, Bare Metal Cloud or something like that, third party. Then you move over and you do Exadata Cloud Service or Exadata Express Service, where all you get is a schema or a processor.
You brought up the Audit Vault 13. Is there an anticipated quarter that it's going to be released in?
Right now, all I can tell you is later this year. It's a pretty big change. There's a lot of stuff coming in 13. Hang on. I'm going to say this because it's a product that's not released. I gotta show you the I don't know what I'm talking about slide. It's just me talking. Don't count on it. Hang on. There it is. Okay. So top part of this. Right now, what we're working on for 13.1 is we hope to have a collector for MongoDB in there. We may or may not. We're working on getting a collector for Hadoop, generic Hadoop, that we're looking at. Those are both looking very positive for 13.1. We've got a complete UI revamp that's in there. Is anyone using Redo Collector for Audit Vault? So this is one of the more interesting features of Audit Vault. When someone makes a change to an audited object, sometimes you don't want to just know that they made the change. You want to know what value they changed something from to, capture the old and new values. So today, we do that basically using LogMiner and Streams. Well, as you probably know, Streams is deprecated and is soon going to be obsolete. It also doesn't work in a multi-tenant database. So in 13.1, we'll be switching from the current Streams implementation to an implementation that focuses on Golden Gate for redo collection. Now, the advantage of that is, and it's going to take us a version or so to get this right. We'll focus on Oracle to start with, but once we've got everything set up the way we want it, we'll expand this capability of doing before and after values to where it's not just Oracle databases, but you can do that in SQL Server databases. And that is one of the most requested features that we get is there a way to handle the same before and after values in SQL Server? So we're very excited about that change, but it's a pretty big engineering effort.